Hello. Today we're going to start talking about the evolution. This is a relatively hard chapter. I don't want anybody to be discouraged. One of the most important thing in my mind is that I would like all of you to hear about it at least one time and try to look at it as a new learning challenge for yourself. So just please try to enjoy it as much as possible and learn it so you can see the other side if you are on the opposite side. If you're not, then I'm glad. So let's jump in and start it. Before we start talking about evolution itself, I want you to understand some very basic definitions. The first one is the fact. What is a fact? And the fact is an observation that has been repeatedly confirmed. I basically read it, but you do understand that there is never a question about facts. Like, you know that if you drop an object, it's going to fall. That's the gravity. The law will actually descriptively generalize about the physical world and how it behaves. So the law is very important. Nobody ever questions that either. The next one is the hypothesis. And the hypothesis is just a statement. Like we hypothesize something about based on observations, and it has to be testable, and it is used to build inferences and explanations. And on the next slide, you will see the most important in terms of understanding evolution is that evolution is a theory. And a lot of people say it's just a theory. But if you think about science and the scientific theory, you got to understand it's much more than just a theory. And here is the definition of scientific theory. It's a well-sustained explanation. It's basically a very good explanation, and that explanation incorporates fact. So fact is much less than the scientific theory. The law is much less than the scientific theory, the scientific law I meant. And it is incorporating inferences and tested hypotheses. So most of the time, you could say, not most of the time, all the time, you can say that the scientific theory is more than anything else. That is an explanation for the fact, the scientific laws, the hypothesis, everything. And it's tested, it is published, and there is no question that these things are happening. So please understand this is a huge difference between the just a theory versus a scientific theory. And I will also ask this on the test, so you should know. I copied the definition of evolution from Helena Curtis and Sue Barnes from a biology book. And they say that evolution can be precisely defined as any change in the frequency of alleles within a gene pool from one generation to the next. So this is just a definition. And now we're going to go back to the history of evolution. So we're going to talk about who taught what when. And you will have to know these scientists. So we're going to start with the earliest thoughts of evolution. The idea of organic evolution states that all life form on Earth is descended from other life through small changes. In other words, all life is linked together by a process of ancestry and descendant. Like you yourself can make up your family tree. Probably a whole lot of you have done it. It's the same thing for all the life forms on Earth. You can actually make up the family tree, who is coming from who, just like yourself. Some of you can go back in their family trees to like 500 years. So you can imagine with the life forms, it could be even much longer. So we're going to start with the ancient Greeks, and they are basically the first ones who realized that all animals were built on a very common plan. In some of the Greek philosophers, like Aristotle, um, realized that everything has been changing through time, and it was a very basic element, the change. However, very soon after Aristotle and the Greek philosophers, um, the dominance of the church basically uh, obeyed the contemplation of evolution for almost 1,000 years. It's kind of crazy. So if you think about it, according to the Bible, all plants and animals were created as we see them today. So basically, it closes out the possibility of change. Um, and people who have thought differently were really basically punished. So very few people dare to think against these ideas. During the 1700s, as more and more discovery um, trips were done and more animals were discovered, basically it became almost completely impossible to explain everything with the biblical view. The first person we have to mention is called Linnaeus, and he is the one who did the first standard classification of organic species. And even though at the time there was only 8,000 species, um, it was hard to imagine that all those species could fit on the ark. And not even thinking about the fact that every year the discovery trips discovered hundreds of new species, like every single time they went somewhere. Um, it was harder and harder to imagine to have all those animals on the Noah Ark. And not only the animals, but also the plants. And how about the microbes? Um, so the question has emerged: how could all of these animals fit on our ark? On the other hand, they also realized that the species in Australia are quite different from the species in the Americas and Europe. Because in Australia, just about every ecologic niche is filled in with marsupial mammals, whereas in Europe, we have the placental mammals, and they look very, very similar. Like you can look at this slide right here, this picture. I mean, they do look different. So the similar eating habits, the similar life habits produces very similar animals, even though they have very different process through their life. So it's interesting. Why is that? That if all the animals got out of the ark in Ararat, Mount Ararat in Turkey, how come in Australia all the marsupials ended up, and in Europe we have all the placentals? So that was a very interesting question with no answer either. The next one we have to talk about Cuvier, and we already did actually talk about George Cuvier. He was the one who first described them and found fossils, and he was the one who realized that some of the animals are extinct actually, which is going really big time against the church. Because if you think God created everything at the same time and they're still around in the same form, so that was against all the explanation around the church. So what can you do? This was an evidence nobody possibly could hide. Um, Cuvier also demonstrated that the animals which become extinct have been replaced really quickly by other animals or species. So how could that be explained by Genesis, which states that all species were created at the same time? This is really hardcore. I mean, just think about, like, Cuvier have seen all this, and himself were very religious. So it had to be like a big debate even in his own beliefs and head. It had to be really hard for him. So I can say that the scientists soon come up with the idea that the Genesis cannot explain the fossil record, but they didn't have any better explanation. So who is the next? The next person is George Buffon. Remember, we already talked about George Buffon because he was the one who tried to explain the age of the Earth by melting and cooling down the iron ball. He did also important steps for the concept of evolution. He was the first to state the concept of species and noted that each species exists as a separate entity. And he also demonstrated that the species can only interbreed among themselves and they cannot interbreed with any other species. That doesn't mean that there are no sex in between different species, but they cannot create offspring, which can also actually reproduce. Because, you know, when you put the donkey and the horse together, you get the mule, but then the mule cannot reproduce any living offspring. So it could happen that there are sex in between different species, but they cannot make reproducing offspring. That's very important. So he demonstrated that no species could interbreed with another. So different species cannot interbreed. He also noted that the environment directly causes variation in the offspring, which with this he was the first to realize that there is a relationship between the environment and the species, and later we call this adaptation. He realized that there are changes due to inheritance of characteristics from both parents, and that's the inheritance. So he was the one who first described the fact that kids are inheriting behavior and characteristics from their parents. And when he puts these two concepts together, he comes up with the statement that modification of organisms are due to inheritance of characteristics and changes caused by the environment characters. Even though he made this fundamental statement, he could not come up with the explanation for these changes which he observed. The next person we have to talk about is Erasmus Darwin. And Erasmus Darwin was actually Charles' grandfather, Charles Darwin, the famous guy's grandfather. Erasmus Darwin have seen that there are many changes going on during ontogeny. Ontogeny is the individual species lifespan, and then inside that it's the individual development. Like the caterpillar will become butterfly, or the tadpole become frog. And of course, when a human or any other animal develops inside the womb, you know, it's going through a lot of changes. This is what we call ontogeny. He saw that in breeding, changes can be recognized from generation to generation, although these changes are extremely teeny tiny. He also realized that the species become adapted to their environment, primarily the way they gather food. For example, the elephant trunk, the giraffe's neck, or by security, like protective coloration, like the wings, the shells, legs, and so on. The next person we have to talk about is Lamarck, and he was one of the greatest naturalists of his time. Lamarck was really important in terms of that he come up with the foundation of modern invertebrate zoology. He was the first to see all life, both plants and animals, as an integrated whole, and he used the term biology for it. So he's the first one who come up with the word biology. It's important that you remember it's Lamarck. He also named first the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which in another word means that the effect of environment could be seen on the offspring. He also found a mechanism for this theory that the change of the environment will lead to changes in needs of the organisms. Animals have to change their habits. I mean, how did the giraffe neck get so long, basically? That's the question. And now, finally, we're going to talk about Charles Darwin. And as you know, he was the person who come up with the most amazing idea. I have this YouTube video there. It's not really a YouTube video, but please copy it and put it on the internet and watch this. This is talking about Charles Darwin and his life. And I kind of want you to watch that. He was born 1809, February the 12th, and he was a medical student and at the University of Edinburgh, and so he learned all the medicine and all the natural history. He was also a theology student. He lived in a pretty wealthy family, so he didn't have to work. So all he did was just study. So he also learned the Bible really good because he went to this Christian school. So he became a doctor, and he went to a theology school. So he knew both sides really well. He was always interested in natural science, so he collected plant and rock species, specimens. Um, he didn't really know what to do with his life. So when his dad heard about this boat going around the earth, it was a discovery trip. Um, he saw that his son would have an opportunity to learn a whole lot during that trip. So he became a company of the captain on the Beagle, which was going around the world. During this trip, it was a 5-year trip. During this trip, he was very, very tedious. So he made an amazing journal of his trip where he collected every kind of plants, animals, and he very detailed described them, draw them, and collected every single thing during this trip. So after he came back home from this trip, all he did is just work on all the stuff he collected on his trip. And this slide just shows the boat, the Beagle, and this is the trip. So they went around the earth, and especially around the Galapagos Island, where he did most of his most important discovery, I should say. So he came to understand that any population consists of individuals that are all slightly different from one another. Just like humans, you don't find two of the same unless they are identical twins. Other than that, every single body is different. Those individuals having a variation that gives them advantage in the environment will stay alive longer, so therefore they have more chances to reproduce and bring capable offspring to that certain environment also. So therefore they pass their traits more frequently to the next generation. The species which are not really good for the environment most likely will die earlier than they can reproduce, so their traits are not passed down. And there is another movie right here, so please look at it. It's really cool. So what he realized, that the more capable longer living animals can have more offsprings, so therefore their traits become more common as the population evolves. And Darwin have called this descent with modification. So this is really, really, really important, because this is how he come up with his amazing theory. As I said, the Galapagos Island had species which you haven't seen anywhere else in the world, and they were quite similar to the ones which existed in South America on the coast. So Darwin was struck by the fact that these birds were slightly different from one island to the next. Uh, so he realized that the key to why this difference existed was connected with the fact that various species live in different kinds of environments. You know, like from island to island in the Galapagos Islands, the environment's slightly different, so the animals have to adapt to those specific conditions. So it was very, very important. And here you can see the Galapagos Islands, which is located right here. Plate tectonically, it's a hotspot. And therefore they had to change their habits to the specific environment. And this is just a figure which he come up with, that there was an ancestral species and they actually went into different kinds, as the different islands had very different environments. So Darwin basically saw the amazing variety of species found on Earth, because he went around. Like if you didn't travel, all you would see is the animals around us. So you wouldn't even think about how could it be, you know. Like if you were traveling, then you see that the one we have here is almost non-existent, you know, compared to the diversity of living things on Earth. And he also saw that there is a huge population of different species. However, because of the competition among population for food, the population number is basically stable, because you have this much given food, which is enough for this much population. That's the problem with humans, that we have much bigger population than basically the food exists. That's why year by year, a whole lot of people dies of hunger because there is just not enough food. So we are much more overpopulated artificially than the environment would let us to be. So he is the one who first realized the stable number in population defined by the food source. And then he saw that not all the offspring survives, but the ones which are the best fit for the certain environment. So he collected enough data for his revolutionary hypothesis of natural selection. The best fit for life survive. And you don't really have to go too far away, because you can just go out, like if you go hunting. What happens with the deer, like I think in the fall, what did I do? So in the fall, when the deer start to try to reproduce, before they can do that, the male deer has to actually do fighting. They fight. Why? So they can actually reproduce with the female ones, because only the ones which are being able to beat the other male deer are able to reproduce. So therefore you see it every year, that the best fit for the environment is the one which can reproduce. So that's the one which is able to survive and give away their traits and be able to go on. So this is very important. The natural selection actually is happening, and you yourself see it every year in the woods when you go out. So here we are. These points the evidence for evolution, and I will ask this on the test, which is coming up. I will ask this on the midterm, so you really will have to know it, because you're gonna have to list it. So the first one is the branching organization of life. All living things organized into branching hierarchy of groups nested within groups, just like your family tree. And the branching structure is based on both anatomical features and molecular structures. So if you look at your genes, it's not only just by anatomy, but also by your genes. So it's very important. The number two is the homology, And the homology is when you have organisms with strikingly different function but the same anatomy, and that suggests a common ancestor. Like there is this picture right here, and you can see the limbs of different vertebrates. Like this one is the human. Uh, the next one is the cat, the whale, and the bat. And they have very different function because we grasp with it. The cat is moving on it, the whale is swimming with it, and the bat is flying. So each of them do something different, but if you look at their bones, they are strikingly similar. It's crazy, they really are. So this is what we call homology. Remember, the very different function but the same anatomical build up. That's the homology. Then just to contrast it, there is the analogy. When you have analogy, that means that you have the same function but very different structure. And this here is the bird wing versus the can't remember the name of this like right now, but you know that they have wings which has no bones versus the bird which has bone structure. So it's very very different. Remember, the same function, very different structures. So there is no evolutionary relationship in between them. Number 3 is the vestigial structures, and the vestigial structures means that there is a lot of animals which have teeny tiny remnants, we call them vestiges, of parts which they don't use anymore. Like one of the good example in human is our tailbone, and you know that we have tailbones, especially when you have fall on it. You have, if you have hurt your tailbone, you know how hurtful it is. But you obviously know that we do not use tails. We don't have tails. However, look it up on the internet. There are some humans who born with tail, and actually sometimes they think that they are actually almost like God, because I just realized that I'm at 27 minutes and I didn't realize it, so I have to stop because YouTube probably won't be able to take this, but I'm gonna try. So I'll see you in the next segment.